Maya, I'm glad we could have a chance to talk about Salastina and some of the other things that you do. And before we get into the final concert of Salastina's season, I want to ask you about something that the Israeli author Amos Oz said about his book, The Same Sea, which came out in 1999.
Okay.
He said, I wrote The Same Sea not as a political allegory about Israelis and Palestinians. I wrote it about something much more gutsy and immediate. I wrote it as a piece of chamber music. In your mind, what is it about chamber music that perhaps him to consider it as both a form to emulate and something that could allow him to be more gutsy and immediate?
Oh, definitely. That's a great question. Thank you for that opener. And it's really nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
I think, there's that famous Nietzsche quote about chamber music being like watching a conversation between highly intelligent people. But I think that's a really kind of frou-frou undersell and a sort of uh, oversimplification of what's actually happening. And for me, chamber music is like when you have a conversation with a friend that you're very, very close with, and you are inspired to think differently because of the presence of your friend and the reception that you get from them and the ideas that they are throwing at you. So that kind of feeling of not necessarily even knowing how you feel or what you think until you articulate it to someone that you trust. I feel like that's the better allegory for what happens in a properly functioning chamber music context. So I think there's that kind of sense that it's elevating everybody who's there, and this idea that you are integral parts of a whole. In a symphony context, there's many more people playing your part, unless you, of course, play a solo instrument. But if you're a string player, there's many other people playing exactly what you're playing. And chamber music, by definition, is that there is no one leader. Everybody's unique part is has its own integrity and is not doubled by any other person. So in that sense, it's a really great metaphor for the individuality of human beings. So Kevin likes to say that chamber music is like where the best parts of being a musician and a human being meet. And I suppose that this author was speaking about the human being component using music as a metaphor. But yeah, so that's how I would answer that, is kind of like the two-way, multi-way communication that you have with close others in a kind of trusting and encouraging space, how that leads you to feel inspired to do things and to articulate yourself in a way that you otherwise might not, and the sense that you are a unique and important part of a bigger picture. Maybe that's what he was going for.
Now you are finishing the season with a big picture work by Mahler,
Yeah,
as arranged by Schoenberg. Um, it's Das Lied von der Erde.
yeah,
Um, and it concludes with the line, "Life is dark as is death." I mean, it's not the last line. The first song ends with the line, "Life is dark as is death." And then the last song includes the line, "I seek peace for my lonely heart." Now, this clearly wasn't Mahler at his most optimistic. I'm not sure that he was ever hugely optimistic to begin with, but there is remarkable beauty throughout. Does the selection of this piece as the closing work you'll perform for this season offer some kind of commentary about the world that we're living in, who we are as people in very troubled times?
oh, yes, certainly. I think, there's the more practical consideration of just the artistic one, that it's a piece that especially Kevin has always really wanted to do. The last Schoenberg Rhine arrangement that we did was Afternoon of a Faun. And last year in June, we did a conductorless performance of an English translation of Così fan tutte. So I think we showed ourselves that we could take on a long and multi musician work with no conductor. So that seemed like, okay, let's finally try this, let's see if we can do it. But conceptually, as a piece, absolutely, I think that we're always trying to be sensitive about reading the room of the current moment. What's in the zeitgeist, how are we feeling about life and the universe and everything. And this piece, the idea of taking tremendous hardship and sublimating it into something beautiful is very, very front of mind for us and was certainly a driver of the selection of this piece.
If you're trying to stay in touch with the zeitgeist at the moment, it seems like it changes on almost a daily basis. So how do you get to the point where you're able to just lock in and say, you know what, this is going to be a statement regardless of how things change?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think that's important too. I mean, I think there's there's the feeling that things are changing in a moment to moment basis, and then there's the zoomed out kind of, oh yeah, that was a phase, there was a theme there, so we try to take our own temperature about what are we really longing to play and share, and why is that, and just sort of trusting that instinct, and of course trying our best to market it well, and make sure that the audience gets the feeling of, if we're saying this is going to be cathartic for you, like our Salastina.com concert that we just did, it was in the mood for an ugly cry, those using that kind of language to try to connect with the audience about, are you feeling kind of how we are right now? Maybe if you are, you might enjoy this concert. So at a certain point, you do have to leave things up to a fate.
Well, if you're thinking about responding to what the emotion might be in the room from the audience, what's the emotion for you as an ensemble when you're playing a work like that?
Oh gosh, commitment, really committing to the meaning of the piece, the beauty of the piece, coming to some sort of common interpretation and committing to that, as a process when we're rehearsing. Of course, we don't have as much time as we would like ever, for that to happen, but that makes the need to come to that sort of consensus all the more expedient. So real commitment, I would say, kind of artistically. Um, let's see. I hope that answers your question. I'm trying to
Well, I'm
remember.
asking, I guess where I'm getting at is
Yeah.
what what's at stake for you emotionally when you're playing a piece like this?
Oh gosh. At stake.
Yeah, what's the process
Yeah.
you go through? I mean, it's if
Yeah.
you're translating these beautiful notes on a page to this emotional experience that the audience is going to have. I can't imagine that it's without emotion for you.
Oh gosh. I mean, that applies across the board for any piece when you're putting yourself out there and your interpretation out there. Um, I think, gosh, for me, maybe some pieces now and then it's even more important to me than usual to kind of communicate what it is that I want to say. Something that I've given some thought to when you ask what are the stakes. It's a little bit personal. I hope that this is um, clear and makes sense, but it's maybe a window into my brain in these kinds of topics and areas, which is just that of being a performer and really, really deeply caring about your uh, love for the piece and the art form and the instrument coming through enough. So are you familiar with, maybe you're like this too, but some people have this kind of fear and intrusive thought, like, if I leave the house, what happens if I run over a pedestrian? And that's a kind of like, yeah, it's an intrusive thought. And for me as a performer, sometimes those intrusive thoughts take the shape of like, oh God, what happens if I don't adequately deliver on the interpretation, the love, the beauty, the perfection of like what's not even in my mind, what's beyond my mind. And of course, that's an impossible expectation to place upon oneself. But for me, it has the same flavor as worrying about hitting a pedestrian in the middle of the street. Like those are the stakes. So for if you're asking about what are the stakes, for me, that's it, is this kind of fear of doing artistic harm by not adequately releasing the beauty of this piece. So, certainly when the piece has as much gravitas as the Mahler does, that gets dialed up in some senses, but in others, it almost makes it a little more of a release because you're feeling like the piece is so clear about what it means. It has words for starters, that always goes a really long way. But it's not to say that I feel the relief of being able to hide behind text, but perhaps a little more confident that the overall meaning and the gravitas is going to come through, and that I am just a vessel at that point, you know? So in some sense, there's a release for me in a piece like this compared to a Beethoven violin sonata or something like that.
Yesterday, I spoke to the choreographer Alonzo King,
Okay.
and he has said to his dancers, over the years, I don't want to see you thinking, I want to see you dancing. Is it possible to just play and not think while you're playing?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think that I like to compare focus and attention to an image of drawing a circle around a 4-year-old and telling the 4-year-old to stay there. So the 4-year-old is likely to leave, you know, and that's okay. You just have to keep bringing it back. And for me, that's what focus and attention is. And improving that muscle is just bringing your focus back faster and faster and recognizing when you have left the circle. So I think that sometimes non-performers may idealize what that looks like, and because it appears so effortless and transcendent and hypnotic and all of those things. But as far as the inner experience of a performer, I think the more accurate description is like that. And it's a little bit like, as a violinist, how I like to explain intonation. You know, the person who has the best intonation hasn't memorized by muscle, you know, exactly where every finger goes after a certain point. What happens is who adjusts the fastest, sometimes even before the out of tune note has been played, right? So for me, attention is like that. It's sort of constantly roping yourself back and building that muscle so that you can do so with more and more agility.
Now, is there something in the air about this particular Mahler work? Because Sony Classical just released a brand new recording on May 5th,
Oh,
um,
wow.
of it
That's
with
news
two
to
with,
me.
with with two men singing
I
the
see.
parts.
Okay, I was aware that Mahler said if no alto is available, you may have another male sing the part, but I did not know that. Thank you for sharing that. I'll
It's a
take.
gorgeous recording, by the way. It's
Thank
it's
you.
it's it's Peter Bigzala, Christian Gerharher, and Gerald Hubert.
Okay.
So it's just piano and the two vocalists.
Oh, lovely. Wow. Thank you for sharing. That's chamber music in a way too.
It is, but do you think there's something in the air that this particular work
Yeah.
is being embraced
I
right
think
now?
so. I do. I think, you know, there's sometimes even the fact that this was news to me, you know, I think that sometimes people just it's synchronicity, right? You know, that's not the same as a coincidence. It's sort of pulling from things in the ether. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Many of the composers that I've spoken to and conductors believe that we're in a golden age of contemporary classical music, or one even says, I don't like contemporary, I call it modern because we're writing music in the modern times.
Mhm.
Do you share that view? And if so, what excites you most about what's going on with new works today?
Yeah, I actually do share that view. I think that maybe, maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this, and those of your listeners who care to do so can on a deep dive through Salastina's blog and read up on my thoughts on contemporary music from a few years ago, which landed me a lot of cheering and some rebuttals. For lack of a better word, but I do have thoughts about this. All that is to say, I think that in the post World War II landscape, the most tired cliche about what happened to ivory tower classical music was, you know, everything that has been said, that could be said with the scalar systems that we have has been said, and therefore it is time to throw some spaghetti at the walls, and that is the only way to be unique. I do not share that view at all in any way and on so many levels. Firstly, I think that the constraints of language are what make a language cogent to others. So it's impossible for everything to have been said. I think to prioritize the uniqueness of a composer's voice above all else is also a little bit um, narcissistic sometimes. And also this kind of idea of like Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge saying, you know, you don't have to like it, but it's important to support it nonetheless. I share that to a degree, but as a player and a presenter, if I don't like it, how should I expect anybody else to, right? So what I observe happening right now in the contemporary or modern music landscape is kind of a turning away from uh, this every a rejection of tonality, really. I see more of an embrace of tonality and using atonality as more of an effect or as contrast now that it's part of our musical language. And for me, that's more effective. um, and I think that the incorporation of electronics into um, contemporary and modern music is also quite effective. That's the world we live in. It's not just an acoustic world. So I think treating electronics as instruments can be interesting. I am not convinced by its applications in maybe 90% of the instances in which I hear this, but sometimes it really feels musically justified and it works, right? So for me, those are two areas in which I do feel a shift of in what's being done with contemporary classical music, and I think that it's also earning it more appeal with audiences. And after all, isn't that the point?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, in the email that I received about you, and Salastina, it included the following line.
Yeah.
By night, they are on a mission to broaden this, and it was prefaced by the film score work that you do. But by night, they are on a mission to broaden the definition of what classical music was, is, and can be. How much does that definition change from season to season, or more broadly, say in 5 or 10 year increments?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, let me put it this way. When you asked your previous question, and I mentioned having written this article about contemporary classical music, that was 8 years ago. And if I were to write that today, it would be different because even 8 years ago, I felt that we were still a bit more in rejection of tonality land. It was just starting, but not necessarily being taken as seriously. One thing I would add too is that the inclusion of non-Western classical musics has also exploded. And Celestina's composer mentor, Derek Sky, is a great example of that. When we first premiered Derek's piece, and when we were working with one of my best friends, Rina Ismail, really closely, what they were doing in their spaces felt very unique to them. Now, when I get applications for our Sounds Promising Young Artist program, it's almost as if every single composer is leading with their identity, their ethnic background, their gender, all of these things. So, what we thought maybe 8 years ago was very fresh and new has already become quite ingrained in the new music culture. So it does change a lot. And so right now we're thinking, gosh, what does that look like now? What's that next frontier for modern music? And if anything, it feels to me a bit like maybe not leaning so heavily on one's unique identity, that maybe that's the beta version of the post World War II, I'm going to invent my own musical language because I'm me and I'm godlike and everyone should care, right? So who knows where that's going to go, but I'm smelling maybe a bit of fatigue with the contemporary classical composer's identity, capital I, being the be all end all basis for their compositions. That maybe that's not so interesting and universal to the audiences.
This is going to be a controversial question,
Yeah.
but are identity politics more important than a good work of art?
That's such a good question. For me, absolutely not. I can answer that unequivocally, and I maybe that's why the tide seems I'm smelling just a little bit of tiredness with that now, and maybe that's why.
Yeah, because I sort of feel like the identity should be wrapped up in the music, not what leads you to the music. That would be my
Exactly.
belief.
Yeah, that's one way to put it, or a point of departure for something that more people can relate to, that is maybe interesting to learn about anecdotally, but not necessary to know.
Yeah, I was at the world premiere of Rena's Requiem that LA Master Chorale did, which I thought was extraordinary. And I don't have any personal connection to her life experience. That didn't make it any less impactful.
Yes, this is actually so Rena and I are hiking buddies, and we actually are going hiking on Saturday. This very topic is something we talk about a lot. And what Rena says about it is kind of what's the next brave thing to say about this? And I really applaud that view. And as I'm sure you noticed that I was there at the premiere as well, that what's most important to her is making these musical languages cogent to each group of people that practices them and making it its own beautiful thing in and of itself. And I think that's so lovely on so many levels, artistically, musically, first and foremost. It's just stunning music to listen to. And I know that for myself, from my husband, who's also a composer, we were there, countless peers and colleagues, and the Indian musicians that we've had the good fortune to interface with, like Siley Oak, who was singing in that performance.
Yeah, well, it's to me, it's like it's the poor metaphor, but it's like cooking. I mean, you bring a lot of different ingredients together to create something, that is satisfying. And
Yeah,
the blend of cultures to me just enriches the opportunities and the experience ultimately.
absolutely. Yeah.
So before we started rolling on this, I talked to you about, I mentioned how much a fan I was during the pandemic of Salastina's happy hours.
Yeah, thank you.
I felt like it was a great tonic for all the stress that we were enduring. What did those happy hours do for you and Salastina?
Oh my goodness, I can't overstate the impact that they had on our organization. First and foremost, they brought 24,000 first-time audience members into our orbit. And I call them audience members even though the room was Zoom. I believe that the Zoom room is as real as any other room is. And it had the consequence from there of tripling our member base, a large proportion of which was now coming from out of state. So that's been notable. It taught us this important lesson that there's an expectation now that all of your content be online and that the online community is as real as any other community. Gosh, I could go on and I'm going to have to stop myself. We also saw that compared to our uh, last full season before COVID. So this was our ninth season in the 2018-2019 season. When we compare our in-person audience numbers to our most recent complete season after COVID, which was last season, not this one, our audience actually grew 94%. And that's stunning to me. I'm so, so grateful when you consider that industry wide, our colleagues in bigger organizations are seeing maybe 2/3 capacity from what they were before COVID. And of course, it's a bit like comparing apples and oranges. We are a tiny grassroots chamber music thing. We can do the sort of one-on-one thing at a scale that bigger organizations can't manage. So I recognize that that's actually been an asset coming out of this time. But I do think that the happy hours and being able to leverage the almost free, not free because we paid all the guest artists for their appearances, but we asked them to share that they were doing these events on social media and with their followers, and being able to benefit from that kind of built-in marketing of those more high-profile guest artists. That was the infusion of marketing that we so desperately needed and had not yet been in a position to pay for ourselves. So it was a huge blessing. So the last thing I would say about lessons of the happy hour time is that, when we live stream our concerts, there's two things I'd like to share. The first is that there are people who live around the corner from our venues who are now opting to watch online. I don't think that's bad. It's not for me to guess or judge what the reasons for that might be. It could be introversion lingering from this time. It could be people who are still too scared to go out. It could be cost. It could be any number of factors. But when I see that, it makes me go, wow, that's a ticket and interaction we might not otherwise have. Even as a parent, we talk so much as a field about how to engage people my age, those who have small children, people in midlife, and live streams make that possible. who knew that that would be an answer to how to engage my demographic? But that was a revelation for me. Wow, I wouldn't otherwise be engaging with this concert because I can't. I can't do that right now. It's just too much effort. We always talk about reducing effort to get a sitter, blah, 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 blah. It's more expensive. So I watched a live stream with my 4-year-old daughter, and she asked if Rachel Podger was me, and it was adorable. But the point is that we at Salastina, when we do our live streams, we recognize that this is an option that is incumbent on us to provide at this point. And equally incumbent is this need to engage with that community and not treat them as invisible. So we always have a staff member on hand chatting with them. We acknowledge them, like kind of waving at the camera at the beginning of each concert. We take their questions for the FAQ at the end of our happy hours. We have a staff member talking with them, collecting questions, texting us during the show so that we're aware of what's going on with that group of people. So all that is to say, happy hour was huge for our growth and huge for understanding the expectations the audience has about technology and how we can leverage that to connect with perhaps different demographics of people, and maintain the connections that we built throughout that time. So that's how I would answer that.
Well, it seems like a lot of our arts organizations are finding, and it's no surprise, that the way music gets consumed is changing radically.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, it's not just from CD to streaming, or now streaming to vinyl again. But it's also, Lako did a series of short films that James Darrow was involved in a whole series of,
You're
that
great.
they were doing. Your opening concert for the next season is going to include, I believe, an Indian dance company.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's not the way things are broadening, and the way that it's being distributed or consumed is changing. How much does that impact how and what you can do? Um, and do you think that the more traditional, just straight ahead concert is going to be something that is less common as a result?
That's a great question. I mean, I can zoom in on this season and sort of the ticket sales results that we had as a sort of data-driven way to answer that. Because what else do I have, really? It would just be kind of blowing smoke out my my ass. I don't want to do that. So yes, I will lead with some hard data. So I think yes, broadly speaking, I agree that um, drawing from different disciplines, different cultures, different communities is going to continue to be really important because that's the way the world is, right? It's ever more connected, and it reflects, this is kind of coming back to our zeitgeist conversation, right? We're reading the room and seeing like the world is a diverse place and it's wonderful, and look at all these synergistic creative opportunities there are right in front of our nose. There's that. At the same time, there's also this kind of iPod fallout. I like to think of it that way, that it really began with the iPod, this idea of I can curate to the quantum level for myself, and that's something that the consumer expects to be able to do as easily as possible. Algorithms do this for them, but even 20 years ago, it was the iPod. So I think that zeitgeist wise, there's this kind of seeming contradiction between we're all just one big species and let's draw from as many people and places and cultures as we can, and also the sanctity of the individual and the individual's preferences and needing to be able to have complete control over all of those things. And I would say as a presenter, that one gets a little more fatiguing. It's certainly less creative, but when people, especially those who don't donate, start making these demands about how specific to my particular needs do I expect you to be? And then customers always right, and we sort of have to go with that. But as a presenter, that's just something that I've noticed, is that there's a bit of a sense of entitlement about making things as easy and fast and perfect for me in every way, parking, elevators, blah, 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 as possible, right? So dotting all those I's, crossing all those T's as far as technology goes is, I think, going to be really important. But data wise, for our tickets, and you'd asked about the more traditional classical concert, our most successful events this past season so far have been the preview that we did with the Indian Dance Company, which nearly tripled the attendance of any of our other happy hours. And I think that was because of the ability that we had to tap into that community, and theirs is so tightly knit. And I'm happy to say that a lot of those people who came to that was their first Salastina event, have already come back subsequently, which is great. Sometimes it takes months, years to see that play out, and that's been heartening to see it play out so quickly. And that one, and when Meredith and Yoshi, our resident violist and cellist respectively, played concertos, Schumann, Hindemith, Casa de Sue, and our Shostakovich cycle. So I think if I were to kind of hazard a guess as to why those three programs were the most successful now, I think Shostakovich carries a bit of the same zeitgeisty gravitas as the Mahler does right now. There's that sense of enduring a difficult time and trying as best one can to sublimate it, although in his case it's more in the direction of darkness. And with Meredith and Yoshi, it's because people are always moved to see artistry. And the most common refrain that we heard after those performances was, we knew they were good, but we didn't know they could do that. So I think that that's a huge thing about what makes art art, right? Is just kind of seeing what people are capable of, and that's always a draw. So shining a spotlight on some of our artists whom the audience felt they already knew, but it was an opportunity to get to know them better. I think that was why that one performed well. And then the synergistic and kind of strategic collaboration with the Indian dance troupe. So I would say yes and no. I feel that the traditional things still carry weight with people, and so do the more interesting cross-cultural things that are also an opportunity to reach a different demographic.
Before I ask you the last question, I do want to congratulate your dog on being completely quiet through the whole interview, because we had a visitor walk in about 2 minutes into the interview and just sitting there quietly, which is also a complication in making plans to go out, because you also have a dog, at least one that I know of.
Right, that's him. That's Noodle.
Yeah. So let's go back to Mahler, and I'm going to ask you about something that Mahler is quoted as having said.
Okay.
He said, "It should be one's sole endeavor to see everything afresh and create it anew." What are the challenges you face as a musician and as a leader to perform and present works that have been performed time and time again, and make them not just new for the audience, but new for you as well?
That's a great question. I think one thing that musicians need to caution against is wanting to perform a traditional work because of the feeling that it's my turn. I don't think that's enough, right? I think that what needs to come first is reading the room, and combining that and letting that inform your own desire to play a certain piece, and to analyze one's desire to play a certain piece. Why is it that I want to play this piece and share this piece? What is it about this piece that is worth communicating to others? Why would anybody want to hear this piece right now, the way that we are going to do it? How are we going to do it? So really being inquisitive in all those different directions, I think is really a joy and a struggle too. But I think that that's really what it comes down to for me, is sometimes, even looking back at Kevin and myself, there were times where we were young when we first started Salastina. This was 13 years ago. And even more if we, go back to our early conversations. So I was 26, just thinking about, oh, I just really want to play this piece. That's a sort of more youthful vigor, ambition, just being kind of drunk with the beauty of it all. But that's not necessarily going to be enough to win over an audience or to justify the presentation of any work, whether it's a traditional work or not. But leave it to Mahler to summarize that in such beautiful words. I mean, one thing I'd also like to mention, if we're talking Mahler quotes, and to tie it back to our conversation about contemporary and modern music, is that tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. That's a Mahler quote that I love, and I think that also informs like the spirit of our approach towards the classical repertoire as well, and it serves as a bridge between, preserving fire also means supporting contemporary music. And something from which I derive a lot of personal glee and chuckles sometimes is when I read reviews every now and then about Salastina, to see how others describe us as either a organization that mostly focuses on the classics, or a organization that focuses heavily on contemporary music, that there doesn't seem to be agreement there. And I love it. I'm okay with it. If people can't peg us, so much the better. That means we're doing Mahler's quote justice.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I've appreciated you taking the time to talk about this.